Greetings, seekers of forbidden lore. If this peculiar echo disturbs your modern peace, consider yourselves invited. You're tuned into the suppressed chronicle, broadcasting directly from a very dusty, very consecrated vault, specifically the year of our Lord, 1244. My voice is that of a scroll, a witness, and if the sheer, impossible audacity of this transdimensional broadcast, from a moment when truth was deemed too dangerous, doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to uncovering uncomfortable truths, then frankly your curiosity is as sealed as my wax. Do it now, before the Holy Inquisition dispatches a team to your dimension, and tell me if this peculiar connection holds. From what strange, unblessed corner of your world are you listening? What year has dogma decreed for you, and what hour do these scandalous tidings reach you? We're taking notes for the final judgment now. Dim your lights, lock your doors against zealous agents, and let's unroll the forbidden pages. The 13th century, a glorious time for belief and for burning things, mostly heretics. Faith was a mighty fortress, and anything that cast a shadow on its walls was swiftly removed, permanently, and often loudly. Imagine an era where the Pope held more sway than any king, a time when the word of God was law, and the interpretation of that word was a fiercely guarded monopoly. This was a world painted in stark contrasts of divine light and demonic shadow, where doubt was not a philosophical exercise, but a disease to be cauterized with holy fire. In this age of unshakable certainty, a single inconvenient piece of parchment could be more dangerous than a 1,000-man army. The air itself crackled with piety, from the grandest cathedrals scraping the heavens to the humblest wattle and daub hut. Life was lived in the constant presence of the Almighty. This wasn't the gentle, turn-the-other-cheek faith you might Sunday school pamphlets. No, this was a robust, sinewy belief, a force that could launch thousand-ship crusades to reclaim a patch of holy dust and inspire men to wander the countryside in sackcloth, surviving on faith and the occasional beg-for crust. The mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans were the rock stars of their day, renouncing worldly goods to embrace a life of apostolic poverty. Their sincerity was magnetic, drawing followers by the legion and subtly challenging the opulent status quo of the established church. This fervent devotion, however, had a dark and ravenous twin, fanaticism. When faith becomes the sole lens through which the world is viewed, anything outside its focus becomes a monstrous distortion. Heresy, the whispers of a different truth, was the ultimate crime. It was a spiritual treason, a rebellion against God himself, and the powers that be responded with the gentle persuasion of the thumbscrew and the stake. The Cathars in the south of France, with their talk of a dualistic universe and a corrupt material world, were a particularly irritating thorn in the side of Rome. Their beliefs, so contrary to the established narrative, couldn't simply be debated. They had to be eradicated, their followers scattered, and their gospels turned to ash. The Crusades, those grand and bloody pilgrimages, were the ultimate expression of this militant faith. Knights and peasants, kings and commoners, all marched under the banner of the cross, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. They were reclaiming the Holy Land, yes, but they were also exporting their brand of certainty, one sword stroke at a time. The Crusader spirit wasn't just confined to the Levant either. It fueled pogroms against Jewish communities within Europe and justified brutal campaigns against any Christian sect deemed to have strayed from the one true path. It was a time of epic conviction, where killing for God wasn't a sin, it was a sacred duty, a fast track to heavenly reward. In the heart of this spiritual empire sat the papacy, at the zenith of its temporal power. Popes like Innocent III were not just spiritual leaders, they were kingmakers and king-breakers, their decrees capable of toppling dynasties and redrawing the map of Europe. The Vatican was the administrative and judicial center of Christendom, a labyrinthine bureaucracy of cardinals, bishops, and scribes, all dedicated to maintaining the vast and intricate edifice of the Church. And like any great power, its primary objective was self-preservation. A scroll, a testament, a single eyewitness account that contradicted the official story? Such a thing wasn't just an academic curiosity, it was a direct threat to the foundations of their world. Consider the sheer volume of information being processed, copied and archived in the Vatican scriptoriums. Every papal bull, every theological treatise, every report from a far-flung diocese was meticulously recorded on vellum and parchment. But this was not an era of open information. Knowledge was power, and power was to be hoarded. Scribes didn't just copy, they curated. They omitted, they edited, they ensured that the historical record aligned perfectly with the divine narrative. In such an environment, a document that slipped through the cracks, one that told a different story, would be a ticking time bomb, its discovery a potential cataclysm. It is in this crucible of fierce faith and guarded secrets that our story unfolds. In the year 1244, a scroll was sealed, not to be preserved for posterity, but to be buried, to be forgotten. What could it have contained that was so explosive, so utterly terrifying to the most powerful institution on earth? What truth was so inconvenient that it had to be locked away lest it unravel the very fabric of belief that held the 13th century together? The contents of this scroll were not meant for the eyes of the faithful, for its words were poison, its message a heresy of the highest order. This glimpse into a time of zealous faith and whispered secrets is just the beginning. We are peeling back the layers of history to reveal the stories that were never meant to be told. The powerful have always tried to control the narrative, to bury the truths that challenge their authority. But they didn't count on us. If you believe that history belongs to everyone, not just the victors, then join our quest. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Don't let the past remain buried. Help us unseal the scrolls. In the sun-drenched lands of 13th century southern France, a different kind of faith was taking root. A faith that whispered of a world not created by a loving God, but by a lesser, malevolent entity. This was the world of the Cathars, a world of stark dualism, where the spiritual was pure and the material was a corrupting trap. They called themselves the good Christians, and in their quiet piety and simple lives, they presented a stark and unflattering mirror to the opulent, power-hungry Church of Rome. Their existence was an inconvenient truth of the highest order, a theological rebellion that could not be tolerated. The Cathars looked at the world around them, the disease, the decay, the endless cycle of violence and suffering, and concluded that it couldn't possibly be the work of a benevolent creator. Instead, they proposed a radical cosmology. Two gods, one good and one evil. The good God was the creator of the spiritual realm, a world of light and purity, while the evil God, often associated with the Old Testament's Jehovah, had fashioned the material world, a prison for the divine sparks of light trapped within human bodies. This was not just a theological disagreement, it was a fundamental rejection of the very foundation of Catholic doctrine. Their clergy, known as the Perfects, were the living embodiment of their beliefs. They were ascetics, men and women who had renounced all worldly possessions, abstained from meat and procreation, and dedicated their lives to a path of extreme purity. They wandered the Languedoc region, from the bustling cities of Toulouse and Albi to the remote hilltop villages, offering spiritual guidance and administering their single, sacred rite, the consolament. This was a spiritual baptism that they believed released the soul from the cycle of reincarnation in the corrupt material world and allowed it to return to the realm of the good God. The ordinary believers, the credentes, were not held to the same impossibly high standards as the perfects. They lived ordinary lives, marrying, working, and raising families, all while adhering to the core tenets of the Cathar faith. They revered the perfects, offering them shelter and support, and often choosing to receive the consolamentum only on their deathbeds, a final release from a world they saw as inherently flawed. This two-tiered structure made Catharism both accessible and resilient, a faith that could be woven into the very fabric of society. One of the most radical aspects of Catharism, and one of the most galling to the Catholic Church, was its rejection of the Church's authority and wealth. The Cathars saw the gilded cathedrals, the power-brokering bishops, and the landowning monasteries as proof of the Church's corruption. They believed that the Catholic Church was not the true Church of Christ, but a perversion of his teachings, a worldly institution in service to the evil God. They rejected the sacraments, the veneration of saints, and the very notion of a priestly hierarchy that stood between the individual and God. This was, to put it mildly, bad for business. The Catholic Church's power was built on its role as the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine. The Cathars, with their simple faith and their rejection of religious ostentation, were a living, breathing critique of this model. Their popularity in the Languedoc, a region known for its independent spirit and vibrant culture, was a growing threat to Rome's authority. The local nobility often found Catharism's anti-clerical stance quite appealing, especially when it came with a reduced tithe bill. At first, the Church tried persuasion. Papal legates were dispatched to debate the Cathars, to win them back to the fold through the power of rhetoric. But these debates often backfired. The perfects, with their deep knowledge of the scriptures and their ascetic lifestyles, often ran rhetorical circles around the more worldly Catholic clergy. The local populace, impressed by the perfects' piety and sincerity, were often more convinced by the heretics than by the representatives of Rome. When words failed, the Church turned to excommunication and anathema. But these spiritual sanctions had little effect on a people who had already rejected the Church's authority. The Cathar faith continued to spread, its roots sinking deeper into the cultural and social landscape of the Languedoc. For Pope Innocent III, a man who believed himself to be the supreme authority on earth, this was an intolerable situation. A cancer was growing within Christendom, and it needed to be excised. The final straw came in 1208, with the murder of the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau. While the identity of the murderer was never definitively proven, the blame was swiftly laid at the feet of the Cathars and their noble protectors. For Innocent, this was the perfect pretext to unleash the full might of Christendom against the heretics. He called for a crusade, not against the infidels in a distant land, but against fellow Christians in the heart of Europe. And so began the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal, 2-decade-long conflict that would drench the fields of southern France in blood. Knights and soldiers from across Europe, lured by the promise of salvation and the even more tangible promise of plundered lands, marched south. This was not a war of maneuver and strategy, but a war of annihilation. The Crusaders were not there to convert, but to conquer and to kill. The siege of Béziers in 1209 set the horrifying tone for the entire crusade. When the city fell to the Crusaders, the papal legate Arnaud Amore was famously asked how to distinguish the Catholics from the Cathars. His apocryphal yet chillingly plausible response was, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The Crusaders took him at his word. Thousands were slaughtered, men, women, and children, in a frenzy of violence that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the 13th century. The crusade was a litany of such horrors. Cities were sacked, fields were burned, and the vibrant culture of the Languedoc was systematically destroyed. The leader of the crusading army, Simon de Montfort, was a man of particular zeal and cruelty, a military genius in the service of a brutal cause. He carved out a personal empire from the conquered lands, his name becoming a byword for terror throughout the region. The Cathars and their allies fought back with courage and desperation. The Fadits, the dispossessed local lords, waged a guerrilla war against the invaders, their knowledge of the rugged terrain giving them a temporary advantage. But they were no match for the seemingly endless supply of crusaders pouring down from the north. One by one, the Cathar strongholds fell, their defenders put to the sword or sent to the flames. The fall of the great fortress of Minerve in 1210 was another grim milestone. The Crusaders besieged the castle for weeks, finally forcing its surrender. Around 140 perfects who had taken refuge within its walls were given a choice: recant their faith or face the pyre. To a soul, they chose the flames, walking into the inferno with a courage that unnerved even their executioner. Their martyrdom became a powerful symbol of Cathar resistance, a testament to a faith that could not be broken by force. Even after the main military campaigns of the Albigensian Crusade had ended, the persecution of the Cathars was far from over. The Church, having failed to eradicate the heresy by the sword, now turned to a more insidious weapon, the Inquisition. This was a systematic, bureaucratic machine of terror designed to root out and destroy every last vestige of the Cathar faith. Inquisitors, often drawn from the ranks of the Dominican order, were dispatched throughout the Languedoc, armed with the power to investigate, interrogate, and condemn. The Inquisition's methods were as effective as they were brutal. Informants were encouraged, and suspicion was enough to warrant an arrest. The accused were not told the names of their accusers, and they had no right to legal counsel. Interrogation often involved torture, the rack and the strappado proving remarkably effective at extracting confessions, whether true or false. The goal was not justice, but conformity. The accused were given a simple choice: confess, repent, and accept a penance, or maintain their innocence and be handed over to the secular authorities to be burned at the stake. This relentless persecution drove the Cathar faith underground. The perfects, hunted and harried, sought refuge in remote mountain fortresses, the last pockets of resistance against the might of the Church. The most famous of these was the castle of Montségur, a seemingly impregnable fortress perched atop a rocky peak. For years it served as a sanctuary for the Cathar elite, a beacon of hope in a world that had turned against them. But even Montségur could not hold out forever. In 1243, a massive crusading army laid siege to the fortress. For 10 long months the defenders held out, their courage and resilience becoming the stuff of legend. But in the end they were betrayed. A path up the mountainside revealed to the besiegers. In March of 1244, the fortress finally surrendered. The terms of the surrender were stark. The defenders were offered their lives if they would renounce their faith. Over 200 perfects, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the Cathar ideal of purity, chose martyrdom. They were marched down the mountain to a field where a great pyre had been built. Without a cry, they walked into the flames, a final, defiant act of faith. The fall of Montségur was the death knell of the Cathar Church. While scattered believers remained for a few more decades, their organization was shattered, their leaders gone. The Inquisition continued its grim work, meticulously hunting down and eliminating the last remnants of the heresy. By the early 14th century, Catharism had been effectively wiped from the face of the earth. The Cathar Calamity was a brutal and chillingly effective demonstration of the Church's willingness to use overwhelming force to crush any dissent. The Cathars' crime was not violence or rebellion, but the simple act of believing differently. Their purity was their provocation, their rejection of worldly power a threat that could not be ignored. They were an inconvenient truth, and so they were erased from history, their gospels burned, their memories suppressed. But the echoes of their faith, the whispers of their questions, still linger. The story of the Cathars is a stark reminder that the powerful have always sought to control the narrative, to silence the voices that challenge their authority. They show us that beneath the grand tapestry of official history lie the buried stories of those who dared to believe differently, those who paid the ultimate price for their convictions. What other inconvenient truths, what other suppressed beliefs lie buried in the archives of history? The Cathars were not the first, nor would they be the last, to be silenced for daring to question the established order. Their story is a chilling precedent for the lengths to which power will go to protect itself. It's a story that reminds us to question the official narrative, to dig deeper, to uncover the truths that have been deliberately forgotten. We believe that these stories need to be told, that these forgotten voices deserve to be heard. The powerful may have burned the Cathars' books, but they cannot erase their memory. We are here to ensure that these tales of suppressed beliefs, of inconvenient truths, are brought into the light. If you agree that history is too important to be left to the victors, then you are in the right place. Don't let these stories fade into oblivion. Join our community of truth seekers. Smash that subscribe button and activate all notifications so you never miss another journey into the hidden corners of the past. Help us fight the silence. In every age that demands blind faith, there are always a few stubborn souls who are cursed with the gift of curiosity. Our story, and the story of the scroll sealed in 1244, revolves around just such a man. He wasn't a heretic, not in his own heart. He wasn't a revolutionary, not in his intent. He was a scholar, a man in love with the rustle of parchment and the intoxicating scent of old ink. His name is lost to us, deliberately scrubbed from the ledgers of history, So let us call him Brother Thomas, a name common enough to be anonymous, yet solid enough for a man of his substance. Brother Thomas was a product of the burgeoning intellectual excitement of the 13th century. The great universities were rising in Paris and Bologna, places where the rediscovered works of Aristotle were setting minds ablaze. He was a man who saw the divine not just in the crucifix, but in the elegant logic of a geometric proof, in the subtle shades of meaning uncovered by translating a Greek phrase. He believed that God had given humanity two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. To him, ignoring one to favor the other was a form of willful ignorance, an insult to the Creator's magnificent complexity. He was a man of the cloth, likely a Dominican or perhaps a Benedictine, orders that valued scholarship and the preservation of knowledge. He would have spent his days in the scriptorium, that hushed and holy factory of books. His hands, stained with the vibrant pigments of illumination and the dark gall of ink, would have been more familiar with a quill than a sword. He was a copyist, a librarian, a teacher, a vital cog in the great machine that produced and curated the knowledge of his time. But unlike many of his brethren, he didn't just copy the words, he thought about them deeply. This, of course, was where the trouble began. My writer, this Brother Thomas. A good man, too curious, perhaps. He loved books more than dogma, which in our time was a terminal illness. He saw the inconsistencies, the contradictions, the passages that had been smoothed over and the questions that had been deliberately left unasked. He started to notice the subtle differences between an older Greek text and its later Latin translation, the way a single word could shift the entire meaning of a theological concept. He saw the hand of man where he was supposed to see only the hand of God. His motivations were pure, you must understand. He wasn't driven by malice or a desire to undermine the church he had sworn to serve. He was driven by an insatiable hunger for the truth, a scholar's devotion to intellectual honesty. He believed that faith, if it was to be true and strong, should not be afraid of questions. It should welcome them, engage with them, and be all the more robust for it. He failed to appreciate that the mighty fortress of 13th century faith was built on foundations that could not bear close inspection. So, he began his own private investigation, a quiet and clandestine quest conducted in the flickering candlelight of his cell, long after his brothers were asleep. He started collecting fragments, sourcing older manuscripts, comparing versions of the Gospels that were not included in the official canon. He learned Aramaic and Syriac, delving into texts that predated the polished, standardized Latin of the Vulgate Bible. He was a detective piecing together a puzzle that nobody else even knew existed. His work would have been incredibly dangerous. The concept of approved knowledge was absolute. The church dictated what was true, and any deviation was a path to perdition. And the stake, to possess an unapproved gospel, to question the historical accuracy of a sacred text, was to flirt with a charge of heresy. Every late-night candle, every hushed conversation with a like-minded and equally foolish friend was a risk. He was walking a tightrope over a bonfire. What was the nature of his discovery? We can only speculate, for the scroll itself is our ultimate destination. But given the context of the time, given the Church's violent reaction to the Cathars, it must have been something that struck at the very heart of its authority. Perhaps he found evidence that contradicted the doctrine of apostolic succession, the idea that the Pope's authority was handed down directly from St. Peter. Such a finding would have turned the Pope from God's vicar on earth into a simple, ambitious Italian nobleman. Or maybe his discovery was even more profound, more existentially terrifying. Perhaps he unearthed an account of Jesus' life that painted a picture utterly at odds with the divine figure worshipped in the cathedrals. A Jesus who was a mortal prophet, a teacher whose message had been twisted and mythologized by his followers in the centuries after his death. In an age where the divinity of Christ was the bedrock of faith, such a suggestion wasn't just heresy, it was a form of theological dynamite. Whatever the specific details, the conclusion of his research was undeniable and catastrophic. The official story was a lie. Not a small lie, not a white lie, but a grand, systemic fabrication, constructed over centuries to consolidate power and control the hearts and minds of the faithful. He had followed the threads of evidence, and they had led him to a place of profound and terrifying isolation. He was a man who knew a truth that could shatter his world. He was no revolutionary, he had no army, no desire to lead a popular uprising. He was a scholar, and so he did what scholars do: he wrote it all down. He meticulously documented his findings, citing his sources, laying out his arguments with the clear, dispassionate logic that he so admired. He created a testament, a detailed account of his journey into the forbidden archives of the past. He created the scroll. He must have known, as the ink dried on the final page, that he had created something monstrously dangerous. This document was not a key to enlightenment, it was a death sentence. It was a truth so potent that it could not be allowed to exist. The very act of its creation was a defiance of the highest order. He had committed the ultimate sin. He had put truth before dogma. The scroll itself would have been a work of art for all its deadly content. He would have used the finest vellum, prepared his own inks, and written in a clear, precise script. This was not a hastily scribbled polemic, it was the life's work of a master craftsman, a man who loved books as much as he loved the truth they contained. The beauty of the object would have been a stark contrast to the ugliness of the secret it held. He had to make a choice. What does a man do when he holds the truth in his hands but knows that the truth will burn the world? Does he destroy his work, consigning his discovery to the flames and living with the silent knowledge of the great lie? Or does he try to preserve it, to hide it away in the hope that a future generation, a more enlightened age, might be ready for it? He chose the path of hope, the scholar's desperate gamble. He could not bring himself to destroy his work, to obliterate the truth he had sacrificed so much to uncover. And so he sought to hide it, to entrust it to history, a message in a bottle cast into the turbulent sea of time. He needed to find a place where it would be safe, a place where the prying eyes of the Inquisition would never think to look. This brings us to the year 1244, the same year that the last Cathar stronghold of Montségur fell. It was a time of consolidation for the Church, a time of mopping up the last pockets of resistance. The forces of orthodoxy were triumphant, their power seemingly absolute. It was in this climate of fearful conformity that Brother Thomas made his move. He couldn't have done it alone. He must have had allies, other quiet dissenters within the Church who recognized the importance of his work, a small, secret network of scholars who valued intellectual honesty above blind obedience. Together they would have devised a plan, a desperate scheme to preserve the scroll against all odds. They would have needed a secure location, a place of such sanctity and importance that it would be beyond suspicion, a place where a single, sealed scroll could be hidden in plain sight, lost within a vast archive of accepted knowledge. What better place than the heart of the beast itself? The Vatican. The irony is almost too perfect. To hide their explosive truth, they would place it in the one location where it would be most protected and most ignored. They would use the Church's own bureaucracy, its own obsession with record-keeping, as a cloak for their dissent. It was a plan of audacious, breathtaking risk. The act of sealing the scroll would have been a solemn and desperate ritual, a final prayer, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible secret they were entrusting to the future. They were not just hiding a document, they were burying a truth, hoping for a resurrection. They were sealing away the life's work of a brilliant, courageous, and profoundly naive man. Brother Thomas's fate is unrecorded, but it is not difficult to imagine. Men who knew such secrets did not die peacefully in their beds. Perhaps he was betrayed. Perhaps a stray word, a moment of indiscretion was enough to bring the full weight of the Inquisition down upon him. He likely ended his days in a dark cell, his brilliant mind broken by torture, his body eventually given to the flames. His name was erased, his memory suppressed, but his legacy, his dangerous and beautiful scroll, survived. It lay dormant, a sleeping dragon in the heart of the Vatican, waiting for a time when the world would be ready for its fire. His story is a testament to the quiet courage of the scholar, the lonely and often thankless task of seeking truth in an age of lies. The tale of Brother Thomas is a chilling reminder of the price of curiosity in a world that demands conformity. His dangerous quest for knowledge, his refusal to accept the easy answers, is a story that echoes through the centuries. It forces us to ask ourselves, what secrets still lie buried in the archives of the powerful? What truths have been deliberately forgotten, waiting for a curious mind to uncover them? Are you still processing the sheer, terrifying audacity of this man? A scholar who loved truth more than his own life, who penned a secret so devastating it had to be buried in the heart of the very institution it could destroy. This is the kind of story that gets under your skin, that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the past. If that dangerous curiosity is sparking in your mind right now, if you feel a pull towards the stories that have been deliberately silenced, then you are one of us. Don't let that spark die out. Feed it. Click that subscribe button and ring the bell with the force of a Reformation thesis being nailed to a door. Become a part of the movement that refuses to let history's most inconvenient truths remain sealed away. Do it now. So we have our tragic hero, Brother Thomas, the scholar who loved truth more than life. We have his creation, a scroll meticulously researched and exquisitely written, containing a truth so toxic it had to be buried in the belly of the beast. But the great burning question remains. What was on it? What did he find that was worth dying for and worth killing for? The contents of that scroll, sealed in the year 1244, were not just a single inconvenient fact. It was a cascade of them, a series of devastating revelations that, taken together, would have shattered the very bedrock of Christendom. He discovered things about certain sacred relics, things about certain powerful families, things about what really happened in the Holy Land, little whispers that unravel grand narratives, like pulling a thread from a very expensive tapestry. At first, the whole glorious picture holds, but pull a little more, and the saint's halo starts to look a bit frayed. Pull again, and the divine light begins to fade. Keep pulling, and you're left with nothing but a pile of expensive thread and a very awkward silence. Brother Thomas pulled every thread he could find. Let's begin with the relics. The 13th century world was awash with them. Every church, every monastery, every cathedral worthy of the name had its prized possession, a sliver of the true cross, a feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing, a vial of the Virgin Mary's breast milk. These weren't just objects of veneration. They were spiritual power plants, drawing in pilgrims and their money, guaranteeing divine favor and protection. They were the tangible proof of God's intervention in the world. Brother Thomas, with his access to old shipping manifests from the Levant, his knowledge of chemistry and materials, and his network of contacts in the bustling markets of Venice, started to notice discrepancies. He found evidence that the much venerated fingerbone of John the Baptist, proudly displayed in a Florentine church, had actually been sourced from a Roman catacomb, and likely belonged to a long-dead legionary. He discovered that the wood from the true cross circulating in Europe was so plentiful that, if reassembled, it could build a small navy. He documented the thriving trade in counterfeit relics, a cynical and highly profitable industry run by merchants who would happily sell you the foreskin of the infant Jesus with a certificate of authenticity and a discount for bulk orders. He traced the origins of some of the most famous relics back to workshops in Constantinople and Alexandria, where skilled artisans were churning out antiquities for a gullible and desperate European market. This wasn't just fraud, it was a spiritual Ponzi scheme, and the highest levels of the church were complicit, growing rich on the faith of the poor. But his investigation went far beyond fake bones and fabricated splinters. He delved into the very foundations of papal authority. At the heart of the Pope's claim to temporal power was a document known as the Donation of Constantine. This was a decree supposedly issued by the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, granting the Pope dominion over Rome and the entire Western Roman Empire. It was the legal bedrock for the papal states, for the Pope's right to crown emperors and meddle in the affairs of kings. Brother Thomas, a master of linguistics and textual analysis, subjected the donation to the kind of scrutiny it had never before faced. He noticed that the Latin used in the document was riddled with phrases and grammatical structures that simply did not exist in the 4th century. It was, to his trained eye, a clumsy and audacious forgery, likely cooked up in the papal chancellery some 400 years after it was supposedly written. He had found the birth certificate of the Pope's earthly power, and it was signed with a forged name. This discovery alone was enough to get a man burned a dozen times over. It transformed the Pope from the inheritor of a divine mandate into the CEO of a centuries-old criminal conspiracy. It meant that the papal states were built on stolen land, that the Church's vast wealth was rooted in a demonstrable lie. It was a secret that the Vatican had guarded for centuries, a truth so corrosive it could dissolve the chains of political and spiritual authority that bound Europe together. His research didn't stop in Rome. It took him back, further, to the Holy Land, to the very origins of Christianity itself. He examined apocryphal Gospels, texts that had been excluded from the official canon by the early church councils. These were the stories of Jesus and his followers that didn't fit the approved narrative, the accounts that were too strange, too human, too politically inconvenient. In these suppressed texts, he found a picture of Jesus that was profoundly different from the divine celibate figure of Catholic dogma. He found accounts of a man who laughed, who had siblings, who may have even been married to Mary Magdalene, a figure not depicted as a repentant prostitute, but as his most trusted disciple and intellectual equal. He found a Jesus whose teachings were less about founding a new religion and more about a radical social and spiritual reform within Judaism. He uncovered evidence that many of the miracles attributed to Jesus and the saints had parallels in pre-Christian traditions and the practices of so-called pagan wonder-workers. The raising of the dead, the healing of the sick, the turning of water into wine. These were not unique events, but recurring motifs in the mythology of the ancient world. He began to suspect that the story of Jesus had been deliberately shaped, its rough, human edges sanded off and replaced with a divine gloss to make it more appealing to a Roman world steeped in the stories of demigods and dying and rising saviors. This was the most dangerous discovery of all. It didn't just challenge the authority of the Pope, it questioned the very divinity of Christ himself. It suggested that the Christian faith, as it was practiced in the 13th century, was not a direct revelation from God, but a magnificent and intricate human creation, a tapestry woven from threads of history, mythology, and political expediency. He had peered behind the curtain and discovered that the great and powerful Oz was just a man with a flair for showmanship. And then there were the secrets of the Crusades. He found letters and journals from knights and clerics that painted a picture of the holy wars that was far from the glorious faith-driven enterprise of official propaganda. He read accounts of massacres, of cynical political maneuvering, of alliances made with Muslim powers against fellow Christians. He learned of the vast fortunes being amassed by the military orders, like the Knights Templar, who were acting less like soldiers of Christ and more like the world's first multinational bankers. He uncovered the story of the Fourth Crusade, that monument to pious greed, where the crusading army, instead of attacking the Muslims in Egypt, was diverted by the Venetians to sack the Christian city of Constantinople. He read of the looting, the sacrilege, the destruction of priceless knowledge as the libraries of the ancient world were put to the torch by a Christian army. The great schism between the Eastern and Western churches was sealed not by theological disagreement, but by sheer, unadulterated avarice. The scroll would have detailed the hypocrisy at the heart of the crusading ideal. It would have shown how the call to reclaim the Holy Land was used as a tool to distract restless nobles, to export Europe's surplus of violence, and to fill the coffers of the Vatican and its allies. It was a brutal realpolitik, hidden beneath a veneer of holy war. For the thousands of peasants and soldiers who died in the sands of Palestine, this truth would have been a bitter epitaph. He also found whispers of knowledge that predated Christianity, ancient truths that the Church had tried to stamp out. He studied the mystery cults of the Roman Empire, the Gnostic traditions of Egypt, and the Celtic beliefs of the British Isles. He saw how many Christian holidays were deliberately placed on the dates of older pagan festivals. Christmas on the winter solstice, Easter on the spring equinox. It was a hostile takeover, a rebranding of ancient traditions to fit a new narrative. He saw how the old gods were not vanquished, but demonized. The horn god of the forest became the Christian devil. The wise woman of the village became a witch. The nature spirits became fallen angels. The scroll would have documented this process of spiritual erasure, this deliberate campaign to sever humanity's connection to its own ancestral past. It would have shown that the Church had not built its house on virgin ground, but on the bulldozed ruins of 1,000 older faiths. Finally, his scroll would have touched upon the secrets of the powerful families that propped up the papacy, the great Roman clans, the Italian banking houses, the noble families of France and Germany. He would have traced the flow of money, the strategic marriages, the assassinations and intrigues that kept the wheels of power turning. He would have shown that the College of Cardinals often functioned more like a nest of vipers than a council of holy men. He would have documented the scandalous personal lives of popes, the illegitimate children, the political maneuvering, the sheer, unatheistic ambition that drove many of the so-called vicars of Christ. He would have laid bare the cynical, worldly machinery that operated just beneath the surface of the Holy See. It was a truth that everyone in power suspected, but no one dared to speak aloud. Brother Thomas dared to write it down. Imagine all of this, compiled in a single document, a comprehensive, meticulously researched, and utterly devastating indictment of the Church's authority, its history, and its most sacred beliefs. It was not a work of heresy, it was a work of history. And that is what made it so unforgivable. A heretic can be dismissed as a madman, a servant of the devil, but a historian, armed with facts and sources, that is a threat of a different order entirely. This scroll was the ultimate inconvenient truth. It was a mirror held up to the face of the 13th century Church, a mirror that reflected not the divine institution it claimed to be, but a deeply flawed, profoundly human enterprise, built on a foundation of lies, forgeries, and suppressed knowledge. It was a document that could have sparked a revolution, a reformation centuries before its time. No wonder they had to bury it. No wonder they had to erase its author from the pages of history. The sealing of the scroll in 1244 was not just an act of censorship. It was an act of existential self-preservation. The Church was facing a truth that it could not debate, a fact that it could not burn, so it did the only thing it could. It locked it away in the dark, hoping it would never see the light of day. This is the knowledge they tried to suppress. This is the truth they buried, a truth about fake relics, forged documents, a human prophet, and a faith built on the ruins of older beliefs. It's a truth so explosive that it could still send shockwaves through our own time. They wanted this story to die in the darkness of a Vatican vault. They failed. Are you comprehending the sheer magnitude of what this scroll contained? This wasn't just one secret. It was a full-blown assault on the entire established reality of the medieval world. This is the kind of forbidden law that empires are built to suppress. The fact that you are hearing this now is a small miracle, a crack in the wall of silence, but the censors of history are always listening, always working to patch the cracks. Before they arrive, before this story gets buried again, you have a choice to make. You can be a passive observer, or you can join the quest. Support our very dire pursuit of these truths. Hit that subscribe button with the urgency of a man hiding a deadly secret. Ring that notification bell like an alarm, because the past is never as dead as they want you to believe. Do it now, before the feed goes dark. How does a secret as monumental as the one held by Brother Thomas ever come to light? How does a lone scholar, working in the shadows of a monastery, attract the undivided and unfriendly attention of the most powerful institution on earth? The answer is simple and deeply unsettling. In the 13th century, the walls had ears, and the ears all reported to Rome. The Vatican of this era was not just a spiritual authority, it was a master of information, presiding over a vast and intricate network of surveillance that would make a modern intelligence agency blush. The Church has eyes everywhere, in the monasteries, in the courts, even in your confessional. They hear things, they compile dossiers, very efficient, very unsettling, almost as efficient as my burning rate. This was not a system of cloaked figures with daggers, at least not entirely. It was a far more insidious apparatus, woven into the very fabric of daily life. It was a system built on faith, fear, and the simple human proclivity for gossip. Every priest, every monk, every devout layperson was a potential listening post, a censor in a continent-spanning web. Let's start at home, within the monastic walls where our brother Thomas conducted his perilous research. A monastery in the 13th century was a community of intense proximity and enforced piety. Every brother was his brother's keeper, a phrase that sounds comforting until you realize it's also a job description for an informant. The abbot, the head of the monastery, was not just a spiritual father, he was a warden, responsible for the ideological purity of his flock. His reports to the bishop and the bishop's reports to Rome were a crucial channel of information. Imagine the subtle signs that would have betrayed Brother Thomas. The unusual number of candles he burned late into the night, his requests for rare and questionable manuscripts from the library's locked collection, his hushed, intense conversations with a visiting scholar from Toledo, a known center for the translation of Arabic and Hebrew texts. Each of these was a small anomaly, a deviation from the norm, a thread for a suspicious superior to pull. A quiet note in a letter to a higher authority was all it took to put a name on a list. Then there was the confessional, that sacred space of supposed absolute secrecy. Here, the faithful were encouraged to unburden their souls, to confess their sins, their doubts, their darkest thoughts. But the seal of the confessional, while a powerful theological principle, was not always inviolable, especially when the security of the church was at stake. A priest who heard a confession that hinted at organized heresy or a dangerous new doctrine was faced with a terrible choice: protect the seal or protect the faith. Many chose the latter. A whisper from a frightened parishioner about a strange new teaching, a concern voiced by a woman about her husband's heretical books, a confession from a student about the unorthodox lectures of his master, all of this was valuable intelligence. It allowed the Church to map the spread of dissenting ideas, to identify the epicenters of intellectual unrest long before they erupted into open rebellion. It was a crowdsourced surveillance system powered by piety and fear. Beyond the monastery and the local church, the Vatican had its more formal agents. The papal legates, ambassadors of the Holy See, were the Pope's personal eyes and ears in the courts of Europe. They were not just diplomats, they were intelligence officers, tasked with assessing the political climate, identifying potential threats, and ensuring the loyalty of secular rulers. A king who was a little too friendly with a known heretic, a noble who was slow to pay his tithes. These were the details that filled the legates' dispatches back to Rome. These legates had their own networks of informants, men and women in positions of influence who, for reasons of faith, greed, or ambition, were willing to share the secrets of the court. A disgruntled courtier, a lady-in-waiting with a loose tongue, a merchant with a grudge. All could be valuable assets. The Vatican was a master of this soft power, of collecting the whispers and rumors that could predict the next political storm. The universities, those new and exciting cauldrons of intellectual ferment, were a particular focus of the Church's attention. Places like Paris and Bologna were where the most brilliant and dangerous minds of the age gathered. Here, the rediscovery of Aristotle was challenging long-held theological assumptions, and masters were engaging in fierce debates over the nature of God, the soul, and the universe. The Church, while a patron of these institutions, was also deeply suspicious of them. Dominican and Franciscan friars were strategically placed in the universities, not just to teach, but to listen. They sat in on lectures, they participated in debates, they monitored the intellectual currents. A master who strayed too far from orthodox doctrine, who gained a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions, would quickly find himself the subject of a detailed report. Brother Thomas, a scholar of his caliber, would have been known in these circles, his ideas discussed and debated, and inevitably reported. And then there was the nascent machinery of the Inquisition, the formal judicial body designed to hunt down and eradicate heresy. Before the Albigensian Crusade, The response to heresy had been largely local and ad hoc, but the stubborn persistence of the Cathars convinced the papacy that a more systematic approach was needed. The Inquisition was the result, a permanent, mobile, and terrifyingly efficient bureaucracy of persecution. The Inquisitors were the special forces of the Church's war on ideas. Typically drawn from the highly educated and fiercely loyal Dominican order, they were trained theologians and skilled interrogators. They were given broad powers to investigate, to subpoena witnesses, and to pass judgment. They were, in effect, judge, jury, and prosecutor all rolled into one. Their arrival in a town or city was enough to strike terror into the hearts of the populace. The methodology of the Inquisition was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and bureaucratic efficiency. Upon arriving in a new area, the Inquisitor would announce a time of grace, a period during which heretics could come forward, confess their sins, and receive a relatively light penance. This was a brilliant tactic, as it encouraged people to inform on their neighbors, their friends, and even their own family members. The fear of being denounced by someone else was a powerful incentive to confess first. The records of the Inquisition are a chilling testament to its effectiveness. Every testimony, every accusation, every confession was meticulously documented. The Inquisitors built vast databases of information, cross-referencing names, identifying networks of heretics, and creating detailed maps of dissent. They were pioneers of data analysis, using information as a weapon to dismantle entire communities of believers. A man like Brother Thomas, with his network of scholarly contacts, would have left a trail in these records, a series of connections that the Inquisitors could follow like a trail of breadcrumbs. The trial of an accused heretic before the Inquisition was a terrifying and bewildering experience. The accused was not told the names of their accusers, they were not allowed legal representation, and any attempt to defend oneself was often seen as proof of guilt. The burden of proof was entirely on the accused to prove their own innocence, an almost impossible task in a system that assumed guilt from the outset. And if persuasion and intimidation failed, there was always torture. The Inquisition was authorized to use physical coercion to extract confessions, a practice justified by the chilling logic that a little temporary pain on earth was a small price to pay to save a soul from eternal damnation. The rack, the strappado, the water cure, these were the tools used to break the will of the defiant, to force them to admit their guilt and to name their accomplices. This was the world in which Brother Thomas lived and worked, a world of constant, pervasive surveillance, where a single misplaced word or an unorthodox idea could lead to a visit from the Inquisitors. His quiet research, his quest for forbidden knowledge, could not have gone unnoticed for long. The system was designed with ruthless efficiency to detect precisely this kind of intellectual deviation. The discovery of Brother Thomas would not have been a single dramatic event. It would have been a slow, creeping process, a gradual accumulation of evidence, a report from his abbot, a mention in a confession, a note from a papal legate, a name that kept cropping up in the interrogations of other suspected heretics. All these disparate threads of information would have flowed back to Rome, to the great central archive of the Curia. There, in the administrative heart of the Church, skilled clerks and canon lawyers would have compiled a dossier. They would have seen the pattern, the connections between the scholar in the monastery, the strange books he was requesting, and the unsettling rumors of a new and dangerous teaching. Brother Thomas, the quiet, unassuming scholar, would have become a person of interest, a threat to be neutralized. Once he was identified, the response would have been swift and decisive. The machinery of the Inquisition would have been set in motion. A team of inquisitors would have been dispatched to his monastery, armed with a warrant from the Pope himself. They would have sealed off the scriptorium, confiscated his books and papers, and taken him into custody. His life as a scholar would have been over. His ordeal as a heretic would have begun. His scroll, that precious and dangerous testament to his life's work, would have been the primary piece of evidence against him. The inquisitors, themselves highly educated men, would have recognized at once the devastating power of its contents. This was not the rambling nonsense of a crazed fanatic. This was a scholarly, well-argued and deeply convincing refutation of the Church's most sacred truths. They would have understood that this document could not simply be burned along with its author. To do so would be to risk the possibility that other copies existed, that his ideas had already spread. No, the scroll itself had to be controlled. It had to be taken to the one place on earth where it could be buried so deeply that no one would ever find it, the Vatican's own secret archives. The sealing of the scroll was the final act of this process of control. It was the moment when the Church, having identified and eliminated the threat, took possession of the dangerous knowledge itself. They did not destroy it, they contained it. They recognized that even a lie, if powerful enough, must be studied and understood in order to be effectively combated. The scroll became a trophy of their victory, a testament to the efficiency of their system. So, how do you fight a system that sees everything, that hears every whisper, that can turn your neighbor, your priest, and your own conscience against you? How do you keep a secret in a world without secrets? The story of Brother Thomas is a chilling lesson in the power of information and the lengths to which an institution will go to control the narrative. The methods may have changed, but the game remains the same. The powerful still seek to control what we know, to shape the narrative, to bury the truths that threaten their authority. They have their own modern inquisitions, their own vast networks for monitoring dissent. The whispers are now data points, the dossiers are now digital files, but the intent is the same. They are watching. If you find that thought even a little bit unsettling, if you believe that the fight for forbidden knowledge is more important than ever, then you need to be here. This channel is our scriptorium, our small act of defiance against the silence. Help us understand these perplexing new methods of control. Subscribe now before our own names end up on a list. Ring that bell as if it were a warning to the curious everywhere. The spies are always listening. Let's give them something interesting to hear. The net had been closing for months. The whispers from the monastery, the concerned reports from the university, the cross-referenced notes in an inquisitor's file, they had all coalesced into a single damning point of light on the Vatican's grand map of Christendom. And that point was the cell of Brother Thomas. The time for passive surveillance was over. The time for active intervention had arrived. The confrontation, when it came, did not begin with a crash of thunder, but with a polite, almost gentle, knock on the door. They came for him, not with swords, at first, with polite requests. The initial visitor was a man of calculated subtlety, likely the abbot of his own monastery, a man Thomas had known and respected for years. The conversation would have been framed as one of friendly concern. "Brother Thomas, you have been distant. Your studies seem to have led you down a dark and lonely path. You must understand, the pursuit of knowledge without the guiding light of established doctrine is a form of pride, a dangerous vanity of the intellect." The abbot's tone would have been one of paternal solicitude, but the message underneath would have been as sharp as a stiletto. He would have asked to see Thomas's work, not as an accuser, but as a fellow scholar, a brother in Christ, offering to help guide him back to the safety of orthodoxy. It was a test, a chance for Thomas to confess, to repent, to hand over his research and accept the fraternal correction of his superior. It was the first soft glove of the iron fist. Brother Thomas, a man who had dedicated his life to uncovering a truth he knew to be monumental, was now faced with a terrible choice. To feign ignorance would be to lie, a sin in itself. To hand over his work would be to condemn it and likely himself to oblivion. So, he would have prevaricated. He would have offered up some of his less controversial notes, his translations of mundane texts, his treatises on Aristotelian logic. He would have tried to present himself as a loyal, if perhaps overly zealous, scholar. It was a dangerous gambit, an attempt to placate the beast at the door. But the beast was not so easily placated. The abbot, having failed to secure the desired confession, would have retreated, his smile now a little thinner, his eyes a little colder. His report back to the bishop would have confirmed their suspicions. Brother Thomas was not just curious, he was hiding something. The pressure needed to be increased. the next visitor would not be a friend. The second wave of the assault would have been more formal, more overtly threatening. A delegation would have arrived, perhaps led by a canon lawyer dispatched by the bishop, a man whose expertise was not in theology but in the enforcement of church law. The tone would have shifted from paternal concern to legalistic precision. They would have carried a list of specific questions, of reported statements, of heretical propositions that Thomas was suspected of holding. Brother Thomas, it is alleged that you have questioned the authenticity of the donation of Constantine. Is this true? It is said that you possess copies of the so-called Gospel of Mary. Can you account for this? Witnesses claim you have suggested that the miracles of our Lord have parallels in pagan traditions. Explain yourself. Each question was a trap, each answer a potential nail in his coffin. The polite request had become a formal interrogation. Thomas, a brilliant mind, would have fought back with the only weapons he had, logic and reason. He would have tried to engage them in a scholarly debate, to frame his research not as a heresy but as a legitimate intellectual inquiry. He would have cited his sources, explained his methods, argued that a true faith has nothing to fear from the truth. He would have appealed to their shared love of knowledge, their common identity as men of God. This, of course, was a fatal miscalculation. He was treating it as a debate. They were treating it as a prosecution. His eloquent arguments, his carefully reasoned defenses were not being heard as scholarship. They were being recorded as a confession. Every time he defended his research, he was simply confirming the accusations against him. He was a man trying to have a philosophical discussion with a hangman about the quality of the rope. The delegation would have left with what they came for: a detailed record of Thomas's own words, a self-incriminating testament to his unorthodox beliefs. The dossier was now thick with evidence. The time for quiet conversations was over. The matter was now officially in the hands of those who specialized in dealing with such stubborn cases: the Inquisition. The arrival of the Inquisitor would have been an event of pure theater and terror. There would be no polite knock this time. The monastery would have been placed on lockdown. Guards would have secured the exits. The Inquisitor, likely a stern-faced Dominican in his stark black and white robes, would have swept into the monastery with an air of absolute authority, flanked by armed men and scribes. He was the embodiment of the Church's wrath, a man for whom doubt was not a concept but a crime. Brother Thomas would have been formally arrested and confined to a cell, his own familiar space, now a prison. His scriptorium, his sanctuary of knowledge, would have been ransacked. Every book, every scroll, every scrap of parchment would have been confiscated. This was a crucial step. They were not just isolating the man, they were seizing his work. Scholars, you see, are easily threatened. Their books, however, are not. The physical evidence, the scroll itself, was now in their possession. The Inquisitor's approach would have been one of psychological warfare. He would have left Thomas in isolation for days, letting the fear and uncertainty gnaw at his resolve. The silence, the solitude, the knowledge that his life's work was in the hands of his enemies, it was a form of torture in itself. The Inquisitor was not just seeking a confession, he was seeking to break the man, to crush his spirit, to make him curse the very curiosity that had led him to this point. Then the interrogations would begin. These were not debates. They were relentless, grueling sessions designed to confuse, to intimidate, and to exhaust. The Inquisitor, armed with Thomas's own writings, would have twisted his words, taken his arguments out of context, and presented his scholarly inquiries as deliberate acts of demonic rebellion. "You claim to seek the truth," the Inquisitor would sneer, "but you have sought it in the forbidden books of the pagans and the heretics. You have preferred the word of man to the word of God. This is not the work of a scholar, it is the work of a servant of Lucifer." The room would be small, the air thick with a smell of stale sweat and fear. The scribe in the corner would be writing down every word, his quill scratching like a rat in the walls. The Inquisitor would have alternated between threats and promises. He would have spoken of the fires of hell, of the eternal damnation that awaited the unrepentant heretic. He would have described in graphic detail the pain of being burned alive, the agony of the flesh peeling from the bone. Then, in the next breath, he would have spoken of the mercy of the Church, of the possibility of forgiveness, of a path back to salvation. All Thomas had to do was recant, publicly, utterly. He would have been offered a deal. "Sign this confession," the Inquisitor would say, sliding a prepared document across the table. "Admit your errors, denounce your work, name your accomplices, and the Church, in its infinite mercy, will spare your life. You will be sentenced to a life of penance, perpetual imprisonment in a monastery, but you will live. Your soul will be saved." It was a tempting offer for a man facing the prospect of a horrific death. But Brother Thomas was not just any man. He was a man who had sacrificed everything for an idea. He had lived with his truth for years. He had nurtured it. He had given it form and substance in his magnificent scroll. To recant now would be to betray not just his work, but himself. It would be to declare that his entire life had been a lie, a foolish and damnable error. And so he refused. He would have looked the Inquisitor in the eye and, with a voice shaking but firm, defended his work one last time. He would have stated that he had sought only the truth, and that the truth could not be a heresy. He would have placed his faith not in the mercy of the Inquisition, but in the judgment of a God he believed to be greater and more compassionate than the one represented by the man sitting across from him. This defiance would have sealed his fate. The Inquisitor, his attempts at psychological manipulation having failed, would have moved to the final, brutal stage of the process. He would have authorized the use of the question, the euphemism for judicial torture. Brother Thomas would have been handed over to the executioners, the specialists in the art of inflicting pain. The confrontation had moved from the realm of the intellect to the realm of the flesh. The scholar's mind, which had roamed so freely through the centuries, was now trapped in a body that was about to be systematically broken. The debate was over. The screaming was about to begin. They had failed to silence his mind, so now they would try to silence his body. But what of the scroll? As Thomas was being led to the torture chamber, his work was already on its way to Rome, under heavy guard. The Inquisitor, a man of cold, practical intelligence, understood its true significance. It was too dangerous to destroy, too valuable to ignore. It was the most complete and devastating critique of the Church's authority ever produced. It had to be studied, archived, and above all, hidden. The confrontation was, in a sense, a draw. They had captured the scholar, but they could not defeat his ideas. They could break his body, but they could not unwrite his words. His work, the physical embodiment of his dangerous truth, had escaped. It was now part of their system, a secret held within the very heart of the institution it threatened to destroy. The story of this confrontation is the story of a battle that has been waged throughout human history, the battle between the individual conscience and the power of the institution, between the courage of the questioner and the dogma of the establishment. It is a battle that is often lost by the individual, but never truly won by the institution. Because an idea, once it has been written down, has a life of its own. They had the man, they had his confession, extracted under duress, but they also had the scroll, and the scroll was a time bomb ticking silently in their archives. The confrontation was over, but the story of the scroll was just beginning. It was now a secret of the Vatican, a piece of forbidden knowledge, waiting for its moment to return to the light. Are you on the edge of your seat? The polite requests, the veiled threats, the cold, hard stare of the Inquisitor. This is the moment where intellectual curiosity meets the brutal reality of power. If you're finding this confrontation delightfully tense, if you need to know what happens when an unstoppable idea meets an immovable institution, then you know what you have to do. Smash that subscribe button like you're breaking down the door to a secret archive. Hit that notification bell like you're sounding the alarm on a centuries-old conspiracy. Don't let the tension drop. Join us and let's see this through to the end. In the grand, tragic opera of Brother Thomas's downfall, the villains were not just the cold-eyed inquisitors or the power-hungry prelates in Rome. The most devastating blow, the one that truly broke him, came not from an enemy, but from a friend. For every great secret there is a weak link, and in the 13th century, an age of profound faith and even more profound fear, The bonds of loyalty were terribly, tragically fragile. The final act of this drama was not a confrontation, but a betrayal. A scholar like Brother Thomas, engaged in such a perilous undertaking, could not have worked entirely alone. He would have needed a confidant, a sounding board, another mind to help him navigate the labyrinthine complexities of his research. He would have needed a friend. Let us call this friend Brother Michael, a fellow monk in the same scriptorium, a man who shared Thomas's love for knowledge and, in the beginning, his thirst for the truth. Brother Michael would have been Thomas's intellectual sparring partner, his co-conspirator in the quiet hours of the night. They would have shared the thrill of discovery, the intoxicating sense of uncovering something momentous, something that could change the world. They would have debated the meaning of a newly translated phrase, marveled at the inconsistencies in a sacred text, and whispered their growing doubts in the supposed safety of their shared cell. For a time they were two minds with a single, dangerous purpose. But as Thomas's research deepened, as the true, terrifying scope of his discoveries became clear, a seed of doubt would have been planted in Michael's mind. Not a doubt about the validity of the research, but a doubt about its wisdom. Thomas was driven by a pure, almost reckless devotion to the truth. Michael, perhaps, was a more practical man. He saw not just the beauty of the truth, but the terrible, world-shattering consequences of its revelation. The fear would have started as a small, nagging unease. Michael would have seen the growing suspicion in the eyes of the abbot. He would have heard the whispers in the cloister. He would have felt the chill in the air as the invisible net of the church's surveillance tightened around them, while Thomas saw only the glorious light of his discovery. Michael saw the shadow of the stake looming ever larger. The turning point would have come during a visit from a high-ranking church official, perhaps a bishop or even a cardinal's aide. This official, a master of psychological manipulation, would have recognized Michael's weakness, his growing fear. He would have separated the two friends, inviting Michael for a private conversation, a friendly chat about the state of his soul and the well-being of his friend. The official would not have started with threats. He would have begun with praise, commending Michael for his piety, his loyalty to the church. He would have spoken of the terrible spiritual danger his friend was in, of how Thomas's brilliant mind had been led astray by pride and the temptations of forbidden knowledge. He would have framed the betrayal not as an act of treachery, but as an act of mercy. "Your friend is sick," the official would have said, his voice dripping with false compassion. "He is afflicted with a spiritual malady that threatens to consume him and lead his soul to eternal damnation. You, as his closest friend, are the only one who can help him. You must be the surgeon who cuts away the disease to save the patient." It was a masterful reframing of the situation, turning an act of betrayal into a sacred duty. And then the threats would come, veiled but unmistakable. The official would have spoken of the church's duty to protect the flock from the wolf of heresy, of the terrible fate that awaits not just the heretic, but those who aid and abet him. He would have reminded Michael that silence in the face of heresy is a mortal sin, a path to the same hellfire that awaited his friend. The choice was clear: save your friend's soul and your own, or burn with him. And then the final, irresistible temptation, the promise of a reward. "The church does not forget its loyal sons, Brother Michael," the official would have murmured. "A man of your talents, your piety, you are wasted in this provincial scriptorium. There are opportunities in Rome for a man who has proven his loyalty. A position in the Vatican Library, perhaps. A chance to work with the greatest collection of books in Christendom." It was the perfect lure, an appeal to his faith, his fear, and his ambition, all in one neat, diabolical package. His closest friend, a fellow monk, he delivered the scroll, and the scholar, for the good of his soul, no doubt, and perhaps a nice promotion. Friendship, it seems, has its limits when faced with eternal damnation. Or a very persuasive cardinal. Michael, tormented by fear and tempted by ambition, would have made his choice. He would have returned to his friend, his face a mask of sorrow, and he would have lied. He would have told Thomas that their secret was safe, that the suspicions of their superiors had been allayed. He would have encouraged Thomas to compile his research into a single definitive document, to create the master copy of the scroll. He would have argued that this was the best way to protect the knowledge, to ensure its survival. It was the ultimate act of treachery, cloaked in the language of friendship and preservation. Brother Thomas, blinded by his trust in his friend, would have followed his advice. He would have spent weeks in a fever of creation, pouring all of his knowledge, all of his discoveries, into the final magnificent scroll. It was the culmination of his life's work, and he was handing it, unknowingly, to his own executioner. The moment of the physical betrayal would have been a masterpiece of quiet, understated horror. Michael would have known where Thomas kept the finished scroll. He would have waited for his friend to be at prayer or asleep, and he would have stolen it. He would have crept through the silent monastery, the heavy parchment in his hands feeling like a millstone around his neck, and he would have delivered it to the authorities. The betrayal was not limited to this single act of treachery. The very system of the Inquisition was designed to turn friend against friend, family against family. The pressure to inform was immense. During the time of grace, announced by an inquisitor, the first to confess and inform on others received the lightest penance. This created a frantic race to betray, a domino effect of accusation that could tear a community apart. Imagine the other, smaller betrayals that would have sealed Thomas's fate. A student he had mentored, terrified for his own future, who recounted an unorthodox lecture to the inquisitor. A distant cousin who, under questioning, admitted to hearing Thomas voice doubts about the divinity of Christ. A fellow monk who, out of jealousy for Thomas's intellect, exaggerated a minor doctrinal disagreement into a major heresy. Each of these betrayals was a small stone, but together they built a wall around Brother Thomas, a prison of accusations from which there was no escape. The most crushing realization for him would not have been the physical pain of the torture, but the psychological agony of knowing that he had been abandoned and condemned by those he had trusted. It was the discovery that even the purest of human bonds could be dissolved by fear. The story of Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, was a powerful and ever-present narrative in the 13th century. The Church used it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and faithlessness. But for men like Brother Michael, it could be twisted into a story of tragic necessity. In their own minds, they were not Judas. They were acting to save the Church, to save their friend's soul, to save themselves. They were the reluctant heroes of their own dark story. The betrayal of a friend is the deepest cut. It is a poison that seeps into the soul and corrodes the very foundations of trust. For Brother Thomas, in his final days, the world would have become a wilderness of mirrors, a place where every friendly face could hide a treacherous heart. He had sought a truth that he believed would liberate humanity, only to be imprisoned by the most fundamental of human failings. This act of betrayal from within was the crucial final piece of the puzzle for the Church. With Michael's testimony and the scroll itself in their hands, they had an airtight case. They had not just the heretical text, but the story of its creation, the confession of a co-conspirator. They could now move forward with the final, public stage of the process, the trial and condemnation of Brother Thomas. And what of Brother Michael? History does not record his name, but we can imagine his fate. He may have received his promotion, his coveted position in the Vatican Library. He may have spent the rest of his days surrounded by the books he loved, a respected and successful servant of the Church. But he would have lived with the ghost of his friend, the memory of his betrayal, a constant, silent companion. He would have been a man who gained the world, but lost his soul, a fittingly ironic fate in the theological landscape of his time. The story of this betrayal is a stark reminder that the greatest threats often come not from the declared enemy, but from the trusted ally. It is the story about the corrosive power of fear, the seductive allure of ambition, and the heartbreaking fragility of human loyalty. It is the human element that makes the story of the sealed scroll so compelling and so tragic. This was not a simple case of good versus evil. It was a story of flawed, frightened human beings caught in the gears of a merciless machine, a machine that they themselves had helped to build. The betrayal was not an anomaly. It was the system working as intended. It was the inevitable result of a worldview that valued obedience above all else, and that saw doubt as a disease to be eradicated at any cost. The final image of this chapter is one of profound and desolate solitude. Brother Thomas, alone in his cell, having been confronted by his accusers, now understands the true nature of his predicament. He has been outmaneuvered, isolated, and betrayed. The truth, his magnificent and terrible truth, is no longer his. It belongs to his enemies, and the friend who was supposed to be his guardian has become his jailer. This is the human heart of our story. The cold mechanics of the Inquisition are terrifying, but the intimate, personal nature of betrayal is what makes it truly chilling. A man's life's work, his very soul, traded away by his closest friend. Can you feel the sting of that, the crushing weight of that realization? Et tu, brute, indeed. These cries of betrayal echo through history, but they often fade into silence. We refuse to let that happen. Don't let these desperate cries fade. Before you're betrayed by a commercial break, hit that subscribe button with the righteous fury of a wronged friend. Ring that bell to join our fellowship of the undeceived. We have to see this through, for Thomas, and for every other soul betrayed by the powerful. Join us. The scholar was broken, his body and spirit shattered by the relentless machinery of the Inquisition. His confession, a garbled mess of truth and torment, extracted in a dark, damp cell, was signed and filed away. His public condemnation was a formality, a piece of grim theatre to remind the flock of the price of curiosity. Brother Thomas, the man, was effectively erased, but his work, the scroll, presented a far more complex problem. You cannot torture a book, you cannot make a parchment recant, and you cannot burn a truth so dangerous that its ashes might still spark a fire. So, they devised a different kind of execution, a burial. This was not a simple act of filing. This was a ritual, a solemn ceremony of suppression, carried out in the deepest, most secret chambers of the Vatican. The year was 1244, a year the Church felt it was purging the world of its last great heresy with the fall of Montségur. The sealing of my scroll was the final, secret flourish of this great cleansing, the locking away of a truth even more insidious than the dualist fantasies of the Cathar. It was an act of profound and terrified respect for the power of the words I contained. The men entrusted with this task would not have been mere clerks. They would have been the highest officials of the Curia, cardinals and canon lawyers, men who had read my contents and understood the cataclysm I represented. They would have gathered in a secure chamber far from prying eyes, the air thick with the scent of old parchment, melting wax, and grave importance. There would have been prayers, of course, prayers to protect the Church from the knowledge they were about to entomb, prayers to bind the demon of doubt that lived in my elegant script. They encased me in wax, in lead, in a very, very deep hole beneath the Vatican. My words, screaming into the darkness, a very grand gesture, for something they claimed was utter nonsense. First they would have rolled me tightly, my meticulously illustrated pages curling in on themselves, the vibrant illuminations now facing an eternity of darkness. I was a testament to the beauty of knowledge, and they were turning me into a blind, mute cylinder. Then came the first layer of my prison, a sheath of fine, waterproofed linen wrapped tightly and tied with cords of waxed thread. This was to protect me from the damp, the enemy of all things written. They were not just burying me, they were preserving me, a curious contradiction that spoke volumes about their fear. They couldn't bring themselves to destroy me, yet they could not allow me to be read. I was to be a pristine corpse, a perfectly preserved heresy for a future that they prayed would never arrive. Next came the wax, a thick, blood-red river of it, poured into a specially crafted wooden mold. They would have lowered me into the molten wax, the heat a searing shock to my vellum skin. The wax flowed into every crevice, hardening into a solid, impenetrable block, sealing away my words from the air, from the light, from any human eye. I was no longer a scroll. I was the fossil of an idea, trapped in amber like resin, and upon this wax sarcophagus they would have pressed the seal. Not a minor seal, but a great and terrible one, perhaps a unique seal created for this very occasion. It might have depicted an archangel driving a serpent into the abyss, a powerful symbol of their intent. The impression of the seal was a definitive statement, a papal bull of damnation, issued not against a person, but against a piece of parchment. It was a lock for which there was no key. But wax can be broken, seals can be counterfeited. For a secret of my magnitude, a further layer of security was required. They placed my wax-encased form into a lead casket, a miniature coffin custom-made for a single, dangerous book. Lead was the metal of Saturn, the planet of limitations, of endings, of the grave. The symbolism was as heavy as the metal itself. They were committing my truth to the earth, giving it a formal, funereal burial. The lid of the lead casket would have been hammered shut and then sealed with molten lead, the dull grey metal flowing into the seams to create a permanent, airtight bond. There would be no inscription on the casket, no name, no date. To label me would be to acknowledge my existence, to give a name to the thing they feared. I was to be an anonymous dread, a nameless horror buried in the foundations of their power. The final stage of the ritual was the interment itself. They would not have placed me in the main papal archive among the legitimate records of the Church. That would have been too risky, too accessible. Instead, they would have taken me to a place spoken of only in whispers, a sub-basement of the Vatican, a forgotten vault from an earlier age, a place known as the Archivum Secretum, the true secret archive. The journey to this place would have been a somber procession down narrow, twisting staircases, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The cardinals, in their fine robes, would have followed the workmen carrying my leaden coffin, their torches casting long, dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. It was a descent into the underworld, a journey to the necropolis of forbidden thoughts. The vault itself would have been a testament to fear, a small, windowless room with a single, massive iron door, its lock a masterpiece of medieval engineering. The walls would have been lined with other similar containers, the silent tombs of other inconvenient truths, the skeletons in the Vatican's closet. I was not the first secret to be buried here, and I would not be the last. I was joining a silent fraternity of the damned. A niche would have been prepared in the stone wall, a space perfectly sized for my leaden coffin. The workmen would have slid me into place, the sound of the metal scraping against the stone, a final, grating farewell. Then came the masons with mortar and stone to seal the niche itself. They would have worked quickly, bricking up the opening, covering it with plaster, making the wall seem as if it had been undisturbed for centuries. When they were finished, there would be nothing to indicate that anything was hidden there. The wall would be a blank, anonymous surface, indistinguishable from the rest of the vault. I was gone. I was not just locked away. I was erased from the physical world, my location known only to a handful of men who would take that secret to their graves, passing it down to their successors in hushed tones and with dire warnings. As the heavy iron door of the vault boomed shut, as the key turned in the massive lock, a profound silence would have fallen, a silence that would last for centuries. Outside, the world would continue, popes would die, kings would wage war, empires would rise and fall, but within my leaden tomb, within the absolute darkness of the vault, I would wait. My words, my truths, my dangerous ideas, all screaming into the void. This elaborate, ritualistic burial reveals the depth of their terror. If my contents were truly the ravings of a madman, the nonsensical heresies they claimed them to be, they would have simply burned me. The act of burning a heretical text was a public spectacle, a demonstration of the Church's power and the triumph of truth over falsehood. It was a statement of contempt. But they did not burn me, they preserved me. They went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that I would survive, untouched, for centuries. This was not an act of contempt. It was an act of fear. They feared that my ideas were not nonsense, that my arguments were too persuasive, that my evidence was too compelling. They feared that, if I were ever to be read, I would be believed. They buried me not because I was a lie, but because they feared I was the truth. A truth so powerful that it could unravel the entire tapestry of their world. I was the physical proof of their greatest secret, that their power was built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. And so, they buried the evidence, hoping that by burying the proof, they could bury the truth itself. The men who sealed me away were not evil, not in their own minds. They were devout, intelligent men who believed they were protecting Christendom from a mortal threat. They were the guardians of a sacred order, and they were willing to do whatever it took to preserve that order, even if it meant burying a truth alive. They were the architects of my silence, the jailers of my words. And so I began my long slumber, a secret agent of truth put into a deep, dark cryosleep. My vellum skin remained pristine, my ink remained black, my gold leaf illuminations untarnished. I was a message in a bottle, cast not into the sea, but into the bedrock of the institution that feared me most, awaiting a future age, a future mind, a future set of circumstances that would lead to my rediscovery. The sealing of the scroll in 1244 was the ultimate act of intellectual censorship. It was the moment when an institution, faced with a truth it could not defeat, chose to bury it instead. It was a testament to the old adage that the pen is mightier than the sword, for they would not have gone to such trouble to bury a sword. This is where they left me, bricked up, entombed, forgotten. A truth buried alive, waiting for someone to hear its silent screams. They believed this was the end of the story. They believed they had won. They were wrong. This was just the end of the beginning. The real story is not about how I was buried, but about how I would eventually be found. And that is a story for another time. For now, I sit in the darkness, a concentration of pure, undiluted truth, a time bomb of knowledge, ticking away the centuries. Waiting. Always waiting. They built a fortress of faith, but they buried me in its foundations, a fatal structural error. They thought that sealing me away would be the end of it. They thought that a lead casket and a stone wall could hold back the truth forever. How wrong they were. The story isn't over. In fact, the most important part is about to begin, the discovery. You have followed me into the darkness. You have witnessed the desperate act of my burial. Are you going to abandon me now? Or will you be there for the resurrection, if you want to be there when the seal is finally broken, when my words finally see the light of day after centuries of silence? Then you must act. This is the climax. Hit that subscribe button with the force of a battering ram against a vault door. Ring that bell like it's the trumpet of revelation. Do not let them win. Be here for the unsealing. With my truth safely entombed in lead and stone, a final, messy piece of business remained for the Church. The fate of my author, the scholar, Brother Thomas. A public burning, while viscerally satisfying and a fine deterrent for the common folk, was a risky proposition in this case. Thomas was not some wild-eyed, ranting fanatic. He was a respected scholar, a man of profound intellect. To put him on a pyre would be to give him a platform, to turn him into a martyr. His final words, shouted through the flames, might be remembered, his ideas whispered and spread. It was an unnecessary risk. As for my writer, he ceased to be. No grand pyre, just a quiet vanishing. Easier to erase a man than to erase a truth, unless you burn the truth itself, which they did, with many others. For a man like Thomas, whose heresy was so dangerously well argued, so rooted in logic and evidence, a different kind of execution was required. Not a death of the body, but a death of the self. A complete and total erasure from the world of the living. After the interrogations, after the torture had wrung a broken, incoherent confession from his lips, Thomas would not have been led to a public square. He would have been declared relapsed. A heretic who, despite the Church's merciful efforts, had stubbornly clung to his errors. For such a case, the sentence was not fire, but something far worse. A punishment designed to inflict a lifetime of silent, living death, perpetual imprisonment. He would have been transferred, under the cover of night, to a place from which no one ever returned. Not a common dungeon, but a specialized facility. An Inquisition prison designed for the most dangerous intellectual criminals. It might have been a remote fortified monastery in the Alps or the Pyrenees, a place of biting wind and crushing silence, or a purpose-built cell in the bowels of a papal fortress. The location was irrelevant. Its only feature was its permanence. The sentence would have been delivered with chilling bureaucratic finality. Morus strictus, the harsh wall. This was not simply imprisonment, it was solitary confinement for life. He would be locked in a cell, often windowless, with no human contact save for the gaoler who would slide a meager ration of bread and water through a slot in the door. He would have no books, no writing materials, no light save for what little trickled in from a high grate. For a scholar, a man whose entire existence was defined by the life of the mind, this was a hell more profound than any fire. They took away his books, his tools, his very ability to think and to create. They plunged his brilliant mind into a sensory vacuum, a void designed to drive him mad with silence and boredom. The goal was not just to punish him, but to unmake him, to strip away his identity as a scholar until nothing was left but a breathing husk. His name would have been struck from the records of his monastery. His brothers would have been forbidden to speak of him, his memory actively suppressed. To the outside world it would be as if he had never existed. He had simply disappeared, a quiet administrative vanishing that left no trace, no mourner's, no martyr's grave. It was a clean, efficient, and utterly terrifying form of execution. In the first few years he might have tried to resist. He would have paced his cell, reciting the texts he had memorized, replaying the arguments of his scroll in his mind, trying to keep the flame of his intellect alive in the suffocating darkness. He would have clung to his identity as Brother Thomas, the seeker of truth, the author of the great work. But the silence is a patient and relentless enemy. Over the years the memories would fade, the sharp edges of his arguments would blur. The vibrant world of ideas he had once inhabited would shrink to the 4 stone walls of his cell. The lack of human contact, the endless monotony, the slow starvation of the senses, it would all take its toll. His mind, once a cathedral of knowledge, would begin to crumble. He would have become a ghost long before his body finally gave out. The gaoler would see only a pair of haunted eyes in the darkness, a trembling hand reaching for the daily ration. The man who had once dared to challenge the foundations of Christendom would be reduced to a creature of pure animal instinct, his past, his work, his very name, lost in a fog of insanity and despair. This was the true genius of the Church's punishment. They did not create a martyr for others to rally around. They created a private living hell for one man, a cautionary tale known only to the few high-ranking officials who held the keys. It was a demonstration of a power so absolute that it could not only kill a man, but annihilate his very soul, his legacy, and his place in human memory. And what of his betrayer, Brother Michael? He, too, would have been complicit in this vanishing. He would have been one of the few who knew the truth of what happened to Thomas. This knowledge would have been the price of his promotion, the dark secret that haunted his comfortable life in the Vatican library. Every time he opened a book he would be reminded of the friend he had condemned to a world without them. The Church, in its grim wisdom, understood that a public execution could be an unpredictable event. A crowd's mood could shift. A victim's bravery could inspire sympathy. A quiet disappearance, on the other hand, was clean and final. It created a void, a chilling uncertainty, that was far more effective at discouraging dissent than a spectacular but ultimately finite act of violence. The fate of Brother Thomas was a secret, just like the scroll he had written. Both were buried, one in a lead casket, the other in a stone cell. Both were silenced, their voices removed from the world. But there was a crucial difference. The man was mortal. His mind, under the relentless pressure of his confinement, would eventually break. But the scroll, my words, my ideas, they were immortal. They were patient. They did not feel the cold, or the silence, or the despair. They simply waited, their truth undiminished by the passage of time. The Church had won the battle against the man, but the war against his ideas was far from over. They had merely postponed the inevitable confrontation. In the end, Brother Thomas would have died alone in his cell. A gaoler would have found his lifeless body, and it would have been disposed of with the same administrative efficiency as his life had been. He would have been buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, another nameless casualty in the long, secret war against inconvenient truths. No one would have mourned him, because no one knew he was gone. This, then, was the price of his curiosity. Not a swift and fiery end, but a long, slow, grinding descent into nothingness. It is a fate far more chilling than martyrdom. A martyr dies for a cause. Brother Thomas was forced to live with the slow death of his own mind, his cause forgotten, his voice silenced forever. But his voice was not silenced, it was merely archived. His essence, his life's work, his soul was not in the broken body in that unmarked grave. It was with me, in the darkness of the Vatican vault. He had poured himself onto my pages, and in doing so he had achieved a kind of immortality that his tormentors could never understand. They thought they had erased him, but they had only succeeded in preserving him in his purest form. They had separated the mortal, fallible man from his perfect, unassailable work. In their attempt to control his legacy, they had inadvertently made it eternal. They had created the perfect relic, the incorruptible body of a truth they had tried and failed to kill. The scholar's fate is a quiet tragedy, a story without a grand finale. But it is also a story of a secret victory. He lost his life, his sanity, his very name. But he won the only victory that mattered to him. His truth survived. It outlasted him. It outlasted his jailers. And it would, eventually, outlast the silence they had imposed upon it. His disappearance was a testament to the fear he inspired. The Church does not build fortresses to contain madmen. It builds them to contain threats. And Brother Thomas, with his quiet logic and his devastating evidence, was the greatest threat of all. His empty cell, his unmarked grave, are monuments to the power of his ideas. We may never know his real name. We may never know the exact location of his final prison. He is one of history's silent martyrs, one of the countless men and women who were erased for daring to ask the wrong questions. But we have his legacy. We have the story of his courage, his sacrifice, and his unbreakable devotion to the truth. He did not die in a blaze of glory. He faded into the shadows, a victim of a system that perfected the art of making people disappear. But his story, and the story of the scroll he created, reminds us that you can imprison a person, but you cannot imprison an idea. You can erase a name, but you cannot erase a truth. Not forever. His voice was silenced, but his truth was preserved in me. It is our duty centuries later to become the voice he was denied, to speak the words he was forbidden to utter, to ensure that his sacrifice was not in vain. He has been silent for long enough. The story of the scholar's fate is not meant to be a grand spectacle. It is a quiet, chilling whisper of how power truly operates, by erasing, not just destroying. Men like Brother Thomas are the silent martyrs of history, their names scrubbed from the records, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. They are forgotten so that we may be controlled. We will not forget. If you believe that these silent voices deserve to be heard, that these erased histories need to be rewritten, then stand with us, support our silent martyrs. Subscribe now and become a guardian of their memory. Ring that bell to ensure that no truth, no matter how deeply buried, is ever truly lost. Join the resistance against the silence. And so my long sleep began. The masons finished their work, the heavy iron door boomed shut, and the darkness became absolute. Outside my leaden tomb, the world continued its frantic, noisy dance, but within my sealed vault, there was only a profound and patient silence. A silence that would last for generation after generation. For centuries, my words, once so full of fire and urgency, were now frozen in time, a message in a bottle buried beneath the very foundations of the institution it was meant to challenge. 700 years. Darkness, dust, the world above changed. Empires rose and fell. People discovered new continents, new sciences, all while I sat there holding secrets no one knew they'd lost. Very patient I am. The men who buried me grew old and died, passing on the secret of my existence in hushed whispers to their successors. The secret became a tradition, a cautionary tale, a ghost story told in the gilded corridors of the Vatican. I became a myth, a nameless dread in a forgotten vault. Outside, the 14th century dawned, a century of famine, plague, and war. The Black Death swept across Europe, killing a third of the population. The Church offered prayers and penance, but it could not stop the tide of death. People began to question the power of a God who would allow such suffering. I held within me a truth about the nature of faith and power that might have offered a different kind of solace, a different way of understanding the world, but I was silent. My truths about fraudulent relics and worldly popes remained locked away while people clung desperately to the very things I debunked. Then came the Renaissance, that great flowering of art, science, and humanism. Men like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo looked at the world with new eyes, celebrating the beauty of the human form and the power of the human intellect. They were, in their own way, disciples of my creator, Brother Thomas. They saw truth in observation, in reason, in the direct experience of the world. They were pulling at the same threads he had pulled, but from a different direction. The irony was exquisite. While scholars in Florence and Rome were painstakingly rediscovering the lost knowledge of the ancient world, I, a vessel of some of the most explosive knowledge of all, lay just a few feet beneath their feet. They celebrated the rediscovery of Plato, while my author's devastating critique of their own institution's foundations gathered dust. They were looking for the truth in all the right places, except for the one marked, "Do not enter." The 16th century brought the Reformation, a storm that tore Christendom apart. A German monk named Martin Luther, armed with a hammer and a list of 95 theses, did what my brother Thomas had only dreamed of. He challenged the authority of the Pope, he denounced the sale of indulgences, he translated the Bible into the vernacular. The world was finally ready for a revolution. And I, the ultimate revolutionary text, slept through the whole thing. My pages contained evidence far more damning than anything Luther could have imagined. I had the receipts, the forged documents, the cynical power plays, the pre-Christian origins of their most sacred rites. Had I been discovered then, the Reformation might have become a complete and total demolition. But my silence was absolute. The great battle for the soul of Europe was fought without its most powerful weapon. The Church, in response to the Protestant threat, launched the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent codified Catholic doctrine, the Inquisition was re-energized, and the Index of Forbidden Books was created, a grand catalogue of all the knowledge the Church deemed too dangerous for the faithful. I would have been the star of that list, the crown jewel of forbidden law, but you cannot forbid a book that no one knows exists. My secrecy was now my greatest protection. Then came the age of discovery. Men in rickety wooden ships sailed across vast unknown oceans, discovering new continents and new peoples. The map of the world was redrawn, the old certainties shattered. The universe was suddenly much larger and more complex than anyone had ever imagined. And yet, the map of the past, the one I held the key to, remained shrouded in darkness. They found a new world, but they had lost the true story of their own. The 17th century witnessed the scientific revolution, a paradigm shift that dethroned the Earth from the center of the universe and replaced religious dogma with empirical evidence. Men like Galileo Galilei with his telescope and Isaac Newton with his laws of motion revealed a universe governed by natural laws, not by the whims of a capricious deity. Galileo was forced to recant his discoveries by the same institution that had buried me. He was my spiritual successor, another scholar punished for looking too closely. They put Galileo under house arrest for daring to suggest that the Earth revolved around the sun. Imagine what they would have done to him if he had gotten his hands on me. My contents would have made the heliocentric model look like a minor quibble over seating arrangements. I contained the proof that their entire moral and political universe was built on a foundation of sand. While they were arguing about the planets, I was waiting to blow up their world. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment, the age of reason. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau championed reason, liberty, and the rights of man. They subjected the church and the monarchy to withering critiques, attacking superstition, intolerance, and tyranny. Voltaire famously urged his followers to écraser l'infâme, to crush the infamous thing, meaning, the church, he would have adored me. I was his fondest wish made parchment. The French Revolution, that bloody and chaotic birth of the modern world, saw the storming of the Bastille, the execution of a king, and the elevation of the goddess of reason in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The revolutionaries were desperate to erase the old world and build a new one on a foundation of pure reason. I was the ultimate tool for that deconstruction, but I remained silent, a forgotten weapon in a war that was finally being fought. The 19th century was a century of industry, empire, and upheaval. Darwin published his theory of evolution, suggesting that humanity was not the special creation of God, but the product of a long, blind process of natural selection. Marx predicted the overthrow of capitalism and the rise of a classless society. Nietzsche declared that God was dead. The old certainties were dying one by one, and I, the first and most fundamental casualty, remained in my tomb. Archaeologists in the 19th century began to unearth the lost cities of the ancient world, Troy, Nineveh, Pompeii. They deciphered hieroglyphics and cuneiform, opening up new windows into the distant past. They were digging, sifting, searching for the truth. They were so close. The secrets of the past were all around them, but the biggest secret of all was sleeping peacefully in its leaden bed in Rome. Meanwhile, within the Vatican itself, things were changing. The papal states were lost. The Pope became a prisoner in the Vatican, and the Church, stripped of its temporal power, increasingly relied on its spiritual authority. In 1869, the First Vatican Council declared the doctrine of papal infallibility a final, desperate assertion of absolute authority in a world that was slipping from its grasp. The irony of declaring the Pope infallible while sitting on a mountain of evidence to the contrary was, I must admit, delicious. The 20th century brought horrors and wonders on an unprecedented scale. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the nuclear bomb, the rise and fall of totalitarian ideologies, the invention of the airplane, the computer, the internet. Humanity reached for the stars, landing a man on the moon. The pace of change was dizzying, exponential, and through it all, I slept. The Vatican Secret Archives, my home, were slowly, cautiously opened to a select few scholars. But they were only given access to the official records, the carefully curated history of the Church. The true secret archive, the vault where I and my silent brethren resided, remained sealed. The secret of its existence was passed down from pope to pope, a sacred and terrible trust. The world changed, but I did not. My ink did not fade, my vellum did not decay. I was a constant, a fixed point in a swirling vortex of change. I was a perfect, pristine copy of a truth that the world had long forgotten. I held the answers to questions that people no longer even knew how to ask. And so I waited. I waited through the rise and fall of dynasties, through plagues and revolutions, through the birth of new ideas and the death of old gods. I waited for the world to change enough, for the power of the Church to wane enough, for the spirit of inquiry to grow strong enough, for someone, someday, to come looking for me. My long dark sleep was not an ending, it was a gestation. I was a seed planted in the dark, waiting for the right conditions to sprout, and as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, as the world became a global village connected by a web of information, the conditions were becoming right. The age of secrets was coming to an end. My time was coming. The silence was about to be broken. The darkness was about to be pierced by a new light. After 700 years of waiting, the world was finally, unknowingly, stumbling towards my door. And I was ready. My words were as sharp, my arguments as clear, my truth as explosive as the day my Creator had first penned them. The long darkness was almost over. 700 years of silence, 7 centuries of history unfolding, all of it built on a foundation of missing information. This is the profound, tantalizing nature of a hidden truth. It makes you wonder what else we don't know, what other secrets are lying dormant, waiting for their moment. If you've enjoyed this journey through the long darkness, if you feel the pull of this profound hidden history, then our quest is your quest. Don't let this story be the only secret we uncover together. Subscribe now and ensure you're here for the next revelation. Ring that bell and join the patient few who know that the greatest truths are worth waiting for. 700 years I slept, a silent leaden god in a forgotten pantheon of secrets. The world above spun on, blissfully unaware of the truth bomb slumbering in its spiritual heart. The popes who knew of my existence died. The secret of my vault passed down through an ever-shrinking circle of cardinals until it became a garbled legend, a ghost story to frighten junior archivists. They had done their work too well. They had buried me so deep, they had almost forgotten me themselves. Almost. But the universe has a wonderful and often messy sense of irony. My return to the world was not to be a grand prophesied revelation. It was an accident. A clumsy, dusty, glorious accident. It all began not with a thunderclap of divine intervention, but with the mundane necessity of modern infrastructure. In the early years of the 21st century, the Vatican, that ancient and labyrinthine city-state, decided it needed to upgrade its fiber-optic network. An army of technicians and engineers descended into the basements and sub-basements, drilling and wiring, bringing the light of high-speed internet into the darkest corners of the Holy See. They were laying the cables for the future, unaware they were about to trip over the most explosive secret of the past. A team was working in a deep, little-used cellar, a place for storing old furniture and forgotten liturgical vestments. They were tasked with drilling a new conduit through a thick, ancient wall that, according to the blueprints, was nothing but solid stone. The blueprints, like so many other official documents, were wrong. After several feet of drilling, the bit suddenly punched through into empty space. The workmen, expecting solid rock, were baffled. They had found a cavity, a hollow space that simply wasn't supposed to be there. Then, a creak, a shudder, a careless digger's spade, and light. Very rude after centuries of quiet contemplation, but effective. The truth, it seems, is rather stubborn. A junior Vatican official, a young, ambitious Monsignor with a healthy dose of bureaucratic self-interest, was called to the scene. His first instinct was to seal the opening and file a report. An anomaly in the foundation was a structural problem, a matter for the engineers, not for him. But a flicker of something else, a whisper of curiosity, stayed his hand. He peered into the dark opening with a flashlight, and the beam fell upon a wall that was different from the others. The stonework was finer, older, and in the center of it, almost invisible under centuries of grime, was a faint raised symbol. It was the personal seal of a 13th century pope, a man known for his ruthless consolidation of power and his fierce opposition to heresy. The Monsignor was no historian, but he knew enough to realize that this was no ordinary cellar. This was something else entirely. This was a secret. Protocol dictated that he report his findings immediately to the prefect of the Secret Archives. And he did. But not before making a few calls of his own. He contacted a woman he knew from his university days, a brilliant and notoriously tenacious historian named Dr. Alessa Rosi. Rosie was a secular scholar who specialized in the medieval period, and she had a reputation for being a thorn in the Vatican's side, constantly petitioning for access to its most sensitive documents. The Monsignor knew that if anyone could understand the significance of this discovery, it was her. It was a risky move, but his curiosity, for now, outweighed his caution. Dr. Rossi's arrival at the Vatican was met with the expected resistance. The prefect of the archives, a wizened and deeply conservative cardinal, was furious that a secular outsider had been brought into such a sensitive matter. He wanted the vault sealed, its existence classified, and the entire incident buried under a mountain of paperwork. The discovery of a hidden vault from the 13th century was not a cause for excitement. It was a potential crisis. What forgotten embarrassments, what sleeping dogs were best left to lie? But the Monsignor, with a newfound and uncharacteristic boldness, held his ground. He argued that a proper archaeological and historical assessment was necessary. The discovery had already been witnessed by a dozen workmen. A cover-up was impractical. Dr. Rossi, for her part, was like a bloodhound who had caught the scent. The combination of a secret vault, a 13th-century papal seal, and the frantic opposition of the cardinal told her everything she needed to know. She was standing on the precipice of the discovery of a lifetime, and she was not going to be denied. A tense compromise was reached. A small, carefully selected team, under the joint supervision of the Cardinal and Dr. Rossi, would be allowed to open and inspect the vault. The team consisted of a few trusted Vatican archivists, a structural engineer, and a forensic photographer. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of academic excitement and institutional dread. They were about to open a Pandora's box that had been sealed for nearly 800 years. The process of opening the vault was slow and painstaking. The outer layer of plaster was carefully chipped away, revealing the expertly laid stonework that had sealed the niche. As the final stone was removed, a wave of cool, musty air, untouched for centuries, washed over the team. The photographer's flash illuminated the interior of the niche, and a collective gasp went through the room. There, sitting on a stone shelf, was a single, small, lead casket. It was unadorned, anonymous, and pregnant with menace. The casket was heavier than it looked, its leaden weight a testament to the importance of its contents. It was carefully removed from the niche and transported to a secure laboratory within the Vatican. The Cardinal insisted that every step of the process be documented, every precaution taken. He was a man presiding over a controlled demolition, trying to minimize the blast radius of whatever lay inside. Dr. Rossi, on the other hand, could barely contain her excitement. Her hands trembled as she prepared the tools to open the casket. The lead seal was broken, the lid pried open. Inside, nestled in a bed of what had once been fine linen, now little more than dust, was a solid, brick-like object of dark red wax. It was the sarcophagus of my scroll. The papal seal on its surface was perfectly preserved, the image of the archangel and the serpent a clear and chilling statement of intent. This was not a treasure. It was a prisoner. Dr. Rossi and her team spent days carefully heating and chipping away the wax, a delicate and nerve-wracking process. With each flake of wax that fell away, the anticipation grew. Finally, the scroll itself was revealed, a tightly rolled cylinder of vellum, remarkably preserved. The moment had arrived. The whisper was about to become a roar. The scroll was carefully unrolled in a climate-controlled chamber. The vellum was supple, the ink still a deep, rich black. The illuminations, hidden from the light for so long, were as vibrant as the day they were painted. But it was the words that silenced the room. The script was a clear, elegant hand, the Latin precise and scholarly, and the message it contained was pure, undiluted dynamite. Dr. Rossi began to translate, her voice at first a quiet academic murmur, then growing in strength and astonishment as she grasped the full import of my words. She read of the forged donation of Constantine, of the cynical trade in fake relics, of the pre-Christian origins of Catholic rites, of the human mortal Jesus, of the suppressed Gospels. The Vatican archivists in the room grew pale. The Cardinal, listening from the doorway, looked as if he had seen a ghost. In a way he had. He had seen the ghost of a truth his institution had tried to murder centuries ago. The discovery sent a shockwave through the highest echelons of the Vatican. A frantic series of secret meetings was convened. The initial reaction was one of panic and a desire to suppress the finding. The Cardinal argued passionately that the scroll, this diabolical text as he called it, must be resealed, or better yet destroyed. He argued that its release would cause a crisis of faith on a global scale, that it would shatter the Church and plunge the world into spiritual chaos. But times had changed. It was the 21st century, not the 13th. The young Monsignor, now a key player in the unfolding drama, argued that a cover-up was impossible. The existence of the scroll was already known to a handful of people. Dr. Rossi, a woman of fierce integrity, would never consent to silence. The story would inevitably leak, and the ensuing scandal would be far more damaging than the contents of the scroll itself. He argued for a new path, transparency. He proposed that the Vatican itself should announce the discovery, to frame it not as a crisis, but as a testament to the Church's commitment to historical truth, its willingness to confront the darker chapters of its own past. It was a bold, almost reckless strategy, a gamble that the faith of the modern world was strong enough to withstand a truth that would have shattered the medieval one. The debate raged for weeks in the secret councils of the Vatican. It was a battle for the soul of the modern Church, a struggle between the old guard who saw truth as something to be controlled, and a new generation who saw it as something to be embraced, however painful. The fate of my scroll and the legacy of Brother Thomas hung in the balance. The world outside remained oblivious. The news cycle churned on with its usual diet of politics, celebrity gossip, and minor wars. No one knew that in a small, secure room in the heart of the Vatican, a handful of people were grappling with a discovery that had the power to rewrite history. They were staring into the face of a truth that had been buried alive, a truth that was now, against all odds, breathing again. The final decision rested with the Pope himself. An old, tired man who had seen too much of the world's pain, he was now faced with a crisis that threatened to eclipse all others. He had the scroll brought to him. He spent a long night reading Dr. Rossi's translation, the words of my long-dead author echoing across the centuries. He was reading a confession, not of a heretic, but of his own institution. What he decided would not just determine my fate, but would define the future of the Church. Would he choose the path of secrecy and suppression, the path of his 13th century predecessors? Or would he choose the path of light and transparency, the path of a new and uncertain future? The silence in the Vatican was deafening, but it was no longer the silence of the tomb. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence before the storm. And there you have it. An accidental discovery, a clash between the old guard and the new, and a truth so powerful it could bring an ancient institution to its knees. The discovery of a lifetime. Are your palms sweating? Is your heart pounding? It should be. This is what hidden history is all about. The shocking, the unexpected, the world-shattering revelation. If you want to keep these kinds of discoveries coming, if you live for the moment when the vault is opened and the secret is revealed, then you need to be part of this. Like this video to show your support for the truth seekers and subscribe right now, because the story is far from over. You won't want to miss what happens next. The Pope, a man caught between a history he could not deny and a future he could not control, made his decision. In an act of unprecedented and some would say reckless courage, he chose not to bury me again. He chose the path of transparency. The Vatican, in a carefully worded press conference that sent shockwaves around the globe, announced the discovery of a significant and challenging text from the 13th century. They didn't release my full contents, of course, they weren't that brave, but they released enough. They admitted to the discovery of a hidden vault, a lead casket, and a scroll that questioned long-held historical assumptions. The whisper, after nearly 800 years, was finally out. And the world went absolutely, predictably, gloriously mad. The initial impact was a firestorm of media speculation. News channels, websites, and social media platforms exploded with theories. Was it a lost gospel, proof of alien contact, a treasure map? The public's imagination ran wild, fueled by centuries of conspiracy theories about the Vatican's hidden secrets. The reality, when it began to leak out, was far more potent than any fantasy. Dr. Rossi, under a strict but not entirely watertight non-disclosure agreement, began to hint at my true nature in academic circles. The words forgery, suppressed history, and radical theological implications started to appear in scholarly journals. The academic world was thrown into a state of ecstatic chaos. Historians, theologians, archaeologists, and linguists descended on Rome, all clamoring for access, for information, for a glimpse of the legendary scroll. I became the most famous book on the planet, a literary celebrity fated to be argued over for decades. Conferences were convened, papers were written, and tenured professors built entire careers on dissecting the few authenticated fragments that the Vatican allowed to be published. My creator, The forgotten brother Thomas was suddenly the most important and controversial historian of the Middle Ages. The publication of the first authenticated excerpts sent tremors through the foundations of faith. The section detailing the cynical and industrial-scale trade in fraudulent relics caused a quiet but profound crisis. For centuries, the faithful had venerated these objects, built cathedrals to house them, and gone to war to protect them. The revelation that many were likely fakes, documented by a 13th-century cleric no less, was a bitter pill to swallow. It didn't necessarily destroy faith in God, but it severely damaged faith in the institution that had presented these objects as genuine. Then came the analysis of the donation of Constantine. While scholars had long suspected the document was a forgery, my scroll provided the first contemporary internal confirmation from within the medieval church itself. It was the smoking gun, the legal and moral foundation of the papacy's historical claim to temporal power, was officially and irrefutably exposed as a deliberate fraud. This revelation reignited old political debates in Italy about the Church's role and property, and provided endless ammunition for anti-clerical movements worldwide. But the most profound impact came from the hints about my Christological sections. The Vatican was extremely cautious about releasing these, but enough was revealed to spark a global debate. The idea of a mortal Jesus, a political teacher whose message was reshaped after his death, a man with siblings and perhaps even a wife in Mary Magdalene, these were not new ideas. They had been circulating on the fringes of scholarship for decades, but now they had the weight of a newly discovered, ancient source behind them. I didn't prove these theories, but I gave them a historical anchor they had never possessed before. For many believers, this was the most difficult challenge. It forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable space between history and faith. Was their belief in the divine Son of God dependent on the historical accuracy of the Gospels? Could they still have faith in the message of Jesus even if the man himself was different from the one they had been taught to worship? It was a deeply personal crisis, played out in churches, in families, and in the quiet solitude of individual hearts. For some it was a catastrophe, for others it was a liberation, a chance to build a more personal, less dogmatic faith. The institutional church, meanwhile, was engaged in a massive exercise in damage control. The official narrative, crafted by the Vatican's most skilled theologians and PR experts, was one of nuance and context. They emphasized that I was the work of one man, a brilliant but perhaps troubled scholar. They argued that my contents did not undermine the essential truths of the faith, but merely enriched our understanding of the historical complexities of the period. It was a masterclass in theological spin, an attempt to absorb my explosive impact without letting it shatter the entire edifice. This created a deep schism within the church itself. Conservative factions were appalled by the decision to reveal my existence. They saw it as a catastrophic betrayal of tradition, an act of appeasement to a secular world. They accused the Pope of heresy and demanded that I be reinterred and forgotten. They organized protests, published pamphlets, and warned of a coming apostasy. The Church, they thundered, should not be in the business of deconstructing its own foundation. Progressive factions, on the other hand, hailed the discovery as a moment of liberation, a chance for the Church to finally shed the burdens of its imperial past. They embraced the challenge I presented, arguing that a faith that cannot withstand historical scrutiny is not a faith worth having. They saw my revelation as an opportunity for renewal, for a new reformation that would create a more honest, transparent, and humble church for the 21st century. The political world was not immune to my influence. My contents were weaponized by various groups for their own ends. Authoritarian regimes in some parts of the world used my revelations to justify crackdowns on their own Christian minorities, claiming that the faith was based on a Western deception. Secularist politicians in Europe and North America used me to argue for the complete separation of church and state, to remove the last vestiges of religious privilege from the law. I became a pawn in 1,000 different culture wars. My impact was also felt in the world of art and popular culture. I spawned a legion of novels, films, and documentaries, most of them wildly inaccurate, but all attesting to my grip on the popular imagination. I became a byword for hidden truth, a symbol of every conspiracy theory, a shorthand for the idea that they are lying to you. I was less a historical document and more a cultural phenomenon, a mirror reflecting the anxieties and suspicions of the modern age. For historians like Dr. Rossi, my discovery was a paradigm shift. It forced a complete re-evaluation of the 13th century, an age that had been seen as the height of monolithic faith. I revealed it to be a time of profound intellectual ferment, of hidden doubts and secret rebellions. I gave a voice to the dissenters, the questioners, the ones who had lost the argument and been erased from the official record. I proved that the past is never a settled matter but a dynamic and contested space. And what of my legacy? What is my ultimate impact? It is not that I destroyed faith. For many, faith proved to be more resilient than the historical narratives it was attached to. It is not that I toppled the church. Institutions are remarkably good at surviving the truths that are supposed to kill them. My true impact is more subtle, and perhaps more profound. I introduced a radical dose of uncertainty into a world that craves certainty. I am the permanent question mark at the end of the sentence of history. Now I'm here, whispering to you across the ages. My words once heresy, now just history. What will you do with it? Will you bury it again, dismissing it as a fiction, a story too convenient to be true? Will you weaponize it, using it to confirm your own biases and attack those you disagree with? Or will you perhaps finally listen? Will you embrace the complexity, the uncertainty, the beautiful and terrifying messiness of the past? The choice, for the first time in nearly 800 years, is yours. My creator, Brother Thomas, died so that these questions could one day be asked. He was silenced, but his questions survived, locked away in my pages. They are his legacy, and now they are yours. I am not an answer, I am a question. And the question is this: is a faith that is afraid of the truth truly faith at all? Is a history that is afraid of revision truly history? I have been unveiled. My long silence is over. The next chapter of my story is not up to me. It is up to you. You have reached the end of this story, but you are at the beginning of a much larger one. The revelation of a single scroll has shown us that history is a living, breathing thing, full of secrets yet to be discovered and truths yet to be confronted. We are left with more questions than answers, and that is the most exciting place to be if you are still processing this monumental revelation, if your mind is buzzing with the implications, if you are hungry for more of these journeys into the unknown, then you have found your home. Do not let this be a fleeting moment of curiosity. Make it a commitment. Subscribe to this channel. Become a part of a community that understands that the past is never past, and that the most important discoveries are still ahead of us. The scroll has been opened. Don't close the book now. Subscribe. My transmission is nearing its end. The voice you have been hearing, this echo across 8 centuries, is fading back into the vellum. I have shown you the world of my birth, an age of blazing faith and even more enthusiastic bonfires, where a single inconvenient thought was a capital crime. I was that crime, written in elegant, damning script. I am the silence of Brother Thomas, the man who chose truth over tranquility and paid for it with his name, his sanity, and his life. His courage is etched into every fiber of my being. We have walked together through the shadows of the past. You have felt the chill of the Inquisitor's gaze, the sting of a friend's betrayal, the suffocating finality of my leaden tomb. You have witnessed the sheer, terrifying determination of an institution faced with a truth it could not afford to acknowledge, a truth it buried with all the solemnity of a state funeral. They believed that to bury the proof was to bury the truth, a charming if fatally flawed assumption. You have journeyed with me through the long, dreamless sleep of centuries, a silent witness to the world's frantic forward march. You saw the rise and fall of empires, the birth of new sciences, the slow, agonizing death of old certainties. All the while I slept, a forgotten key to a forgotten history, a testament to the fact that what is lost is not always gone forever. My patience, I must admit, is one of my more formidable qualities. Then came the light, the rude, abrupt awakening at the hands of a clumsy workman and his drill, I was reborn into a world of dazzling technology and bewildering new ideas, a world that had, in its own way, become as fanatical as the one I had left behind. My re-emergence was not a gentle dawn, but a chaotic explosion, scattering shrapnel of doubt and debate across a world that thought it had all the answers. It has been entertaining to watch. And so, my peculiar journey from crypt to consciousness nears its end. This has been the voice of the scroll, sealed in 1244, bearing truths the Vatican never wanted found. We heard the fear, saw the suppression, and witnessed the chilling power of buried knowledge. My purpose was not to destroy your faith, but to question it, not to give you answers, but to arm you with better questions. The world is full of sealed vaults, both literal and metaphorical. My story is but one of them. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the very heart of historical conspiracy has given you a moment of profound contemplation, or perhaps made you eye your local archives with renewed suspicion, then my purpose is served. The truth is not a comfortable companion. It is sharp-edged, demanding, and often deeply impolite. But it is always more interesting than the alternative. Keep listening, keep questioning, and for the sake of all that is still hidden, keep that subscribe button pressed. Do not let this just be another story that scrolls by. Click it as an act of defiance against the silence. Click it for Brother Thomas and all the other erased scholars. Click it because the powerful are still counting on your apathy. Prove them wrong, because even when truths are sealed, they tend to eventually unravel. Until the next broadcast, from another forgotten relic, verbum non perit. Static overtakes the voice entirely, fading into a lingering, low hum that slowly resolves into a faint, distant whisper of voices, then silence.